I'm Vivian Marsh, 54 years old, and I spent 32 years rising from a family that treated my ambitions as a joke to 2 stars and command of the largest naval base in the world. For most of my life, I gave my loyalty and my patience to people who had already decided I was the smallest possible version of myself. But the day a young Marine tore up my orders at the Norfolk gate in front of a line of cars, and a stranger had to kneel on the pavement to fit them back together and press them into my hand, I finally understood what I had been carrying all those years, and I made a choice about how to answer it that changed everything. Have you ever been underestimated by the very people whose belief you wanted most? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. The summer I turned 10, my father came home from a 6-month deployment smelling of salt and diesel, and the whole house rearranged itself around him the way a tide rearranges sand. Harold Marsh was a boatswain's mate, a man who measured the world in wet decks and strong backs, and when he was home, he filled every room he stood in. I used to sit on the kitchen floor while he told my mother about the sea, about lines and winches and storms that stood the bow on end, and I would memorize the words, like a language I was forbidden to speak. One night I asked him if a girl could do what he did. He laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. That was the thing I would spend 40 years trying to explain to people. It was a warm laugh, an affectionate laugh, the laugh of a man who loved me and had already decided what I was. "The real Navy's a wet deck and a strong back, sweetheart," he said, ruffling my hair. "It's no place for a girl who reads too much." In our house, the Navy was a country my father came home from, and I was never going to get a passport. My brother Glenn was 3 years older and learned the lesson before I did. He turned it into a game. He would catch me reading the encyclopedia entry on naval history and snap to attention, throwing me a sloppy salute. I, Admiral Vivian," he would say. "Want me to swab the driveway?" The whole family found it funny. I learned to smile when they laughed, because smiling was cheaper than crying, and it ended the moment faster. The nickname followed me through grade school and into high school, Admiral Vivian, the joke that everyone in my family thought was the kindest thing they could say about my ambitions. There was one person who never laughed. My mother, Constance, was a quiet woman who had married a loud life, and she had a way of finding me after the jokes had run their course. She kept a shoebox on the top shelf of the hall closet, behind the winter blankets, and one afternoon when I was 12, she took it down and showed me what was inside. Report cards, a blue ribbon from a science fair, a newspaper clipping, soft with handling, about a woman who had become a naval officer. "You don't have to be loud to be somebody," she told me. "You just have to keep going." She put the box back before my father came home. It was the first secret we ever kept together, and it would not be the last. I kept going. I read everything I could find about ships and the men, and the few women who ran them. I made myself useful in ways that did not require anyone's permission. And when I was 18, and standing in the kitchen with a letter in my hand, I told my family I had earned a path to a Navy commission through a college program. I did not want applause. I did not even want my father to be proud. Not really. I wanted him to look at me the way he looked at the horizon when he talked about the sea, like I was a thing that was possible. He looked at the letter, then at me, and he said, "College Navy. Huh." He set down his coffee. "Well, they'll teach you to salute anyway." Then he asked Glenn to help him with the truck, and the conversation was over. My mother walked me to my room later and pressed $40 into my hand that I knew she had saved out of the grocery money. "For books," she whispered. "Keep going." What stays with me from those years is not the big refusals, but the small ones, the daily arithmetic of a family that had quietly decided where I fit. When Glenn wanted something, the table listened. When I spoke, the table waited politely for me to finish so the real conversation could resume. I was not mistreated. I was filed. There is a particular loneliness in being loved and overlooked at the same time, in knowing that the people at your own dinner table would step in front of a bus for you and would also never, not once, ask you a single question about the thing you loved most. So I stopped offering it to them. I kept a notebook instead, a cheap spiral thing I bought with my own money, and in it I wrote down everything I learned about ships and the sea and the people who ran them, and I told that notebook the things I could not tell the kitchen. I used to think the notebook was a sad thing, a child talking to paper because no one at home would listen. I do not think that anymore. I think it was the first command I ever kept, a small private vessel that no one could file away or laugh at or hand off to my brother. Years later, on the bridge of an actual destroyer, I would feel an echo of that notebook, the same quiet certainty that this at least was mine, and that I knew how to run it whether anyone believed I could or not. My father had given me the sea by talking about it at the kitchen table. He just never understood that a person can fall in love with a country they have been told they will never be allowed to enter, and that sometimes the telling is exactly what makes the love unbreakable. The morning I left for college, I stood at the bus stop at the end of our street with one duffel bag and a head full of things I could not say. I looked back at the house. The windows were dark, all of them, except for the kitchen where one light was on. My mother was standing in it, watching me through the glass. She did not wave. She just stood there in the light so I would have something to look at while I waited for the bus to carry me toward the country my father said I would never enter. I have commanded ships since then. I have stood on bridges in weather that would have impressed even him. But I have never in my life felt as far from home or as determined to deserve a place in it as I did at that bus stop with one light burning behind me. I was commissioned an ensign in the spring of 1994, 22 years old, in a white uniform that had been pressed so many times it could have stood up on its own. The ceremony was held in a hall full of families, and I scanned that crowd the way you scan a coastline for a light you are afraid will not be there. My father was not there. He had a thing at the marina, Glenn told me later, a boat he had to look at. My mother came alone. She rode 3 hours on a bus to do it. When the moment came to pin the gold bars on my collar, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the clasp. My mother's hands were shaking when she pinned the gold on. My father's were busy somewhere else. I did not let it stop me, because by then I had learned that the work did not care who was watching. I went to sea. I learned the parts of a ship the way my father had, except I learned them from the top down instead of the bottom up, and I discovered that the sea did not care about my last name or my brother's nickname or my father's opinion. The sea only cared whether you knew your job when it counted. And in the early hours of a night in 1999, it counted. I was a lieutenant then, 27 years old, the engineering officer aboard a destroyer in the middle of a black ocean, when a fuel line failed and a fire took hold in a space below the waterline. I will not dress it up. It was the worst night of my life, and the night I found out who I was. The space filled with smoke and heat that warped the air, and somewhere in it a young sailor went down. I led the damage control teams through that compartment for 4 hours, in and out of the smoke, and at some point I went back in one last time and carried a man out across my shoulders because there was no one else close enough to do it. We saved the ship. We saved him. When it was over and the sun came up on a scorched but floating destroyer, my hands would not stop shaking, and I thought of my mother at the commissioning, and I understood that some shaking is fear and some is just the body holding more than it was built to hold. They gave me the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for that night. It is the highest decoration the Navy gives for an act of heroism not involving direct combat with an enemy. When I came home and told the family, my father listened to about half of it, and then he asked, "Did anybody important notice?" Before I could answer, Glenn jumped in with news about his new boat dealership, the loan he had gotten, the showroom he was going to build. I had carried a sailor out of smoke that night. At dinner, the headline was Glenn's boat loan. That was the pattern, and it held for 20 years. I would arrive home in uniform, fresh off a command or a promotion, and the relatives would ask when I was going to settle down. Glenn took to introducing me to his friends with a particular phrase. "This is my sister. She does paperwork for the Navy." Sometimes he would add, "She's got a desk somewhere in Norfolk. Real exciting stuff." I commanded a destroyer. I had 300 sailors who would have followed me into another fire. And in my brother's mouth, I was a woman with a desk and a stapler. My mother kept her counter-narrative. The shoebox became 2 shoeboxes. She clipped every mention of me from base newspapers and local papers, every promotion notice, even the ones I never thought to mail home. She found them anyway. She had a network of Navy wives and retired chiefs who passed her things, and she kept them all in those boxes on the top shelf, a quiet archive of a daughter the rest of the family had filed under paperwork. There was a Thanksgiving, I think it was 2006, when I came home straight from a deployment, still tired in the particular way the sea makes you tired, the kind of tired that lives behind your eyes for a week. An uncle asked me what I actually did all day on a ship. Before I could answer, Glenn said, She files things, important Navy files. Everyone laughed, and I laughed too because I had learned that laughter was the toll you paid to keep your seat at the table. But later, washing dishes beside my mother at the sink, I caught her watching me with an expression I could not name at the time and can name now. It was apology. She was sorry for all of them, and she could not say it out loud in that house. So instead, she dried every plate I washed and stood close enough that our shoulders touched, and that was how my mother said the things the rest of them never would. I want to be fair to my family because this is not a story about monsters. My father was not a cruel man. Glenn was not a villain. They were ordinary people who had built a picture of me when I was small and had simply never thought to look up and check whether the picture still matched. That is the quiet way most people get overlooked, not by malice but by inattention, by the laziness of a certainty that was formed early and never revisited. The danger of that kind of dismissal is precisely that it does not feel like cruelty to the people doing it. To them, it feels like knowing you. And the hardest thing in the world is to keep becoming someone in front of an audience that decided years ago they already knew the ending of your story. Somewhere in my 30s, I stopped calling home after promotions. I told myself it was discipline, that an officer does not need her family's applause to do her duty. That was a lie I found comfortable. The truth was simpler and sadder. I had learned that the call would end with a question about Glenn, and I had decided I would rather have the silence than the disappointment. It is a strange thing to make peace with. You tell yourself the wound has closed and you go on, and you do not notice that what has actually happened is that the wound has just learned to stop bleeding where anyone can see it. By the spring of 2026, I was a rear admiral, 2 stars, 54 years old, and the Navy had decided to make me the commander of Navy Region Mid-Atlantic, which meant that Naval Station Norfolk, the largest naval base in the world, would fall under my command. I had spent 32 years getting to a place my father said did not exist for me. And the day before the change of command ceremony, I did what I have done before every major command I have ever held. I went to see the place alone, with no entourage and no fanfare, dressed like a civilian, so I could feel it the way an ordinary person feels it before the ceremony turns it into theater. I flew in a day early, rented a plain sedan at the airport, and drove to the base in slacks and a travel jacket. My stars and my dress uniform zipped inside the garment bag in the back seat. My orders, the official document directing me to report and assume command, were printed on a single sheet of paper folded in my jacket pocket, because I am old enough to still trust paper. I pulled up to the gate in the middle of the afternoon, rolled down my window, and handed my identification and my orders to the young Marine working the lane. He was a lance corporal, maybe 21 years old, part of a Marine security force augmenting the base. His name was Maddox. He took my identification, and then he unfolded my orders and read them, and I watched his face do the thing I had watched faces do my entire life. He read the words, Commander, Navy Region, Mid-Atlantic. And he looked at the middle-aged woman in a rental car in civilian clothes, and he decided the two things could not possibly belong together. "These orders are fake, ma'am," he said. He said it loudly with a small smile, the smile of a young man who thinks he has caught something. "Nobody reports to run a whole region in a rental with a paper printout. You want to try that again?" I kept my voice even. "Lance Corporal, those orders are genuine. If you'll call the installation duty officer, he can verify them in about 30 seconds. He did not call anyone. That is the part I think about still. He had a phone and a chain of command and a radio on his shoulder, and he chose to use none of them, because the easiest thing in the world is to be certain about a stranger you have already decided is beneath you. A line of cars had begun to form behind me, and he became aware of his audience. And something in him reached for the bigger gesture. He held up my orders so the cars could see them. "No paperwork, no entry," he announced, and then he tore the sheet in half, and in half again, and let the pieces fall onto the asphalt by my window. "Step aside and turn that car around." I watched 2 torn halves of my orders settle on the pavement, and I did the hardest thing a sailor ever learns to do. I stayed still. Every year of rank in me wanted to put this young man at attention with 3 quiet words. But 32 years had taught me that the truth does not need me to shout for it, and it just needs me to wait for it. So I put the car in park, folded my hands in my lap, and I said very calmly, "I'm not going anywhere, Lance Corporal. Please call your duty officer." Behind him, a Marine Staff Sergeant named Beckett had been watching the lane, and I saw his expression change. He was older, smarter, and he had caught something in the way I was sitting that did not fit the story Maddox was telling himself. He took a step toward us, his hand coming up, his mouth opening to say something. He had begun to sense that the ground under this moment was not what his lance corporal thought it was. For a moment, I simply existed inside it. The thing I had felt my whole life now made literal on a stretch of base asphalt. A young man with a fraction of my years and none of my history had looked at me and seen nothing worth the courtesy of a phone call. The cars behind me idled. Someone tapped a horn. Maddox squared his shoulders, pleased with himself, certain he had defended his gate from a fraud. And I thought, with a strange and almost detached calm, that there was a kind of terrible honesty in what he had done. My family had spent 50 years doing this exact thing to me in slow motion, spread out across holidays and phone calls and polite, patient silences. This boy had just compressed all of it into 90 seconds on a Tuesday afternoon. In a way, I could almost have thanked him for the clarity of it. I have been asked since then why I did not simply tell him, why I did not say the words, "Lance Corporal, I am a rear admiral, and you will call your duty officer right now." And the truth is that I had used those words before in my career, when a situation required it, when sailors' lives or the mission depended on rank doing its work. But this was not that. This was a young man deciding my worth from across a lane, and if I had reached for my rank in that moment, I would only have been teaching him that the lesson was about rank. That the woman in the rental car deserved courtesy because she turned out to be an admiral. That is the opposite of what I wanted him to learn. I wanted him to understand that she had deserved courtesy when he thought she was nobody at all. So I kept my rank in my pocket with my torn orders, and I waited, and I let the truth find its own way to the surface. That was when the staff car arrived. It came up the inbound lane and stopped short, and a Navy captain got out, a man in service uniform with the silver eagle of an 06 on his collar. His name was Reuben Stahl, and he was the commanding officer of the installation, the man who had spent the previous 3 weeks preparing the entire base to receive its new admiral. He took one look at me sitting in the rental car, and the color went out of his face. Then he looked down at the pavement, at the 4 torn pieces of paper lying by my tire. And I watched him understand the whole thing in one breath. He knelt down on the asphalt in his service uniform. He gathered the torn pieces of my orders one by one. He fit them together in his hands, the way you would reassemble something broken and precious, and he read my name on them. Then he stood, and he stepped to my window, and he pressed the torn halves of my orders back into my open hand, and he came to attention, and he saluted me. "Admiral Marsh," he said, his voice tight. "We've been expecting you, ma'am. I am so sorry." The word traveled down the lane like a cold wind. Admiral. I saw Lance Corporal Maddox go pale, the smile dying on his face, his eyes moving from the captain, saluting me to the torn paper in my hand, to the 2 stars he had not been able to imagine. He understood all at once that he had just torn up the orders of the woman who, by this time tomorrow, would command everything he stood on, every gate, every pier, every ship in the largest naval base on Earth. The gate went completely silent. I held 2 torn halves of paper together in my palm, a Marine frozen at attention in front of me, and for one long moment, nobody on that pavement could breathe. I did not say anything cutting. I returned Captain Stahl's salute, told him I would see him in the morning, and asked him quietly to make sure the gate kept running smoothly behind me. Then I drove on to the base I would command, parked near the water, and sat for a while looking at the ships. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because the stories people tell about moments like this always end with the heroine feeling vindicated, and that is not what I felt. I felt tired, and I felt 10 years old again, sitting on a kitchen floor while a man I loved laughed and decided what I was. That night, in my hotel room, I taped my orders back together. I sat at the little desk and lined up the torn edges and ran a strip of tape down the seam, and then I sat looking at the document, whole again but scarred, the tear line running right through the words, "Assume command." A stranger had looked at me and seen exactly what my father always saw, the smallest possible version of me. The uniform changes, the stars change. But that particular look, the one that decides who you are before you have said a word, I would know it anywhere, on anyone's face. I called Lorna Pike. Lorna and I had been lieutenants together a lifetime ago, and she had retired a captain, and she was the one person on Earth who knew the whole map of me, the family and the fire and the nickname and the silence. I told her what had happened at the gate. I expected her to be furious on my behalf. Instead, after a long pause, she said something that turned the whole night around. "Vivian," she said, "that kid has no idea he just handed you your entire childhood at a guard shack. So before you do anything, I want you to be sure of something. Don't burn him to settle a debt he didn't run up." I sat with that. Outside the window, the lights of the base ran down to the black water. "What do you mean?" I said, though I knew exactly what she meant. "I mean, you've got 50 years of being told you're nothing standing in line behind you tonight, and that boy at the gate is the first one in 50 years you're actually allowed to punish. And it would be so easy. One sentence from you and that kid's career is finished. But he's not your father, Viv. He's just a dumb 21-year-old who made the same mistake your whole family made. The difference is you finally have the power to decide what happens next. So decide who you want to be, not what you want to do to him. Who you want to be." I thought about the easy paths. I could have a quiet word with his command, and a young Marine's career would end in a footnote, and no one would ever question it, because he had earned it. Or I could make an example of him in front of the whole base, stand him up at attention, and dismantle him publicly, the way I had been dismantled, quietly, for half a century. Both of those paths were open to me. And I realized, sitting there with my taped orders, that I did not want either one. I did not want him punished. I wanted him taught. There is a difference between those two things, and my father had never learned it, and I had spent my whole life paying the cost of that ignorance. I was not going to hand the bill to a stranger. I taped the orders not because I needed them, a replacement copy was one phone call away, but because I wanted to remember the seam. There is a powerful temptation, when you finally hold authority, to use it to erase every moment you spent without it. I have watched that temptation ruin good officers. They spend the back half of their careers quietly settling the debts of the front half, and they never once notice that the people they are punishing are not the people who hurt them. The young sailor who reminds them of a bully, the junior officer who has their brother's easy confidence. They mistake the echo for the original, and they call it leadership. I did not want to become that woman. I wanted the tear to stay visible, taped, but never hidden, so that I would never forget exactly what it feels like to stand on the powerless side of someone else's certainty. That seam was going to make me a better commander than any war college ever had. Because a person who has been dismissed knows something a person who never has cannot learn from a book. We know what it costs to be looked through. We know the specific small death of watching someone decide who you are and being given no say in the verdict. And if we are careful, if we are honest with ourselves, that knowledge becomes the thing that makes us merciful, not the thing that makes us cruel. The choice between those two outcomes is the whole game. It is the only real question that power ever asks you, and most people answer it without realizing they were asked. I taped my orders so I would remember to answer it on purpose. Then the phone rang again, and it was Glenn. He had heard from a cousin that something happened at the gate, because the Navy is a small town wearing a large uniform and news travels. And my brother, true to 30 years of form, did not ask if I was all right. His first words were, "What did you do, Viv?" "What do you mean, what did I do?" I said. "I mean, you can't just show up places acting like you own them. What happened? Did you make a scene? You always do this. You show up and you expect everybody to roll out a carpet." I stood at the window for a moment, the taped orders in my hand, my brother's voice in my ear, narrating a version of me that had never once been true. And I felt something I had not expected. Not anger, something closer to grief, clean and clear. He could not help it. The picture of me in his head was 40 years old, and he had never updated it. And tomorrow morning, whether he understood it or not, the Navy was going to update it for him. I set the taped orders upright against the lamp, like a small monument to everything I had carried, and I told my brother I would see him at the ceremony, and I hung up, and I decided exactly who I was going to be in the morning. I assumed command the way I had planned, but the gate changed how I did it. Before the ceremony, I met with Captain Stahl in his office, and he was a man bracing for a storm. He stood when I came in, and he stayed standing, and the first thing out of his mouth was an offer to bring the hammer down. "Ma'am, the entire security force is humiliated by what happened yesterday," he said. "I want you to know we will deal with the Lance Corporal. His chain of command is ready to handle it hard. By the end of the week, it'll be resolved." I sat down and gestured for him to do the same. "You'll deal with him by teaching him, Captain," I said, "not by feeding him to me." Stahl blinked. He had clearly rehearsed a different conversation. "Ma'am, that young man made a bad call yesterday," I said. "He made it loudly and he made it in public, and it was genuinely a failure of judgment. But I have spent 32 years watching this Navy decide what to do with people who fail. And I have noticed that we are very good at ending people and very bad at growing them. I would like this command to be the other way around, so no, you are not going to end his career to make me feel better. You are going to make sure he learns something he will carry for the next 20 years. When the all-hands came, I told the story. I did not name him. I stood in front of the assembled command in my dress uniform with 2 stars on each shoulder, and I told them that the day before, in civilian clothes and a rental car, I had handed my orders to a young sentry, and he had looked at me and decided I was a fraud, and he had torn those orders up on the pavement. A small, uncomfortable noise went through the room, and then I told them the truth. I wanted to be the spine of my command. A sailor's rank is the least interesting thing about them, I said. And the day you start guessing people's worth from their clothes or their car or their age or anything you can see from across a gate is the day you fail the watch. I was that woman at the gate yesterday. But every single day, all of you are standing at some gate, looking at some person, deciding who they are before they've said a word. Don't. You will be wrong more often than you can afford to be. Give people the dignity of finding out who they actually are before you decide what they're worth. After the ceremony, Vice Admiral Brandt found me. Curtis Brandt was a 3-star, the presiding officer for the change of command, a man who had seen 40 years of the Navy's best and worst. He pulled me aside near the water, and he looked at me with something like curiosity. "I heard about the gate," he said, "and I heard what you did about it, which was nothing. You know, most new flags would have made an example out of that kid. Stood him up, broke him down, sent a message about who's in charge now." He paused. "I've watched admirals and a young Marine for a lot less than tearing up their orders. You made one instead. That's rarer than the stars, Vivian. A lot rarer." The room was quiet when I finished, the particular quiet of people recognizing themselves in a story they had expected to be about someone else. I had meant for it to land that way. Every one of them had stood a watch or worked a counter or read a service record and made a fast judgment about a human being based on the thinnest possible evidence. I had done it myself, more times than I would ever admit from a podium. The point of the story was not that I stood above them, clean and wise. The point was that the job demanded we fight the instinct anyway, every single day, because the cost of being wrong at a gate is not measured in paperwork. It is measured in the dignity of the people we have sworn to serve. And dignity, once taken from someone in public, is a very hard thing to hand back. I told them I expected to be held to that standard myself. That if any sailor on the installation ever watched me judge a person by their clothes or their car or their rank, they had my permission to remember this speech and hold it against me. That is the part most leaders leave out, the part where you put yourself under your own rule. It is easy to set a standard for other people. It is much harder to mean it about yourself, to invite the correction, to make your own conduct the test case. But a standard that only points downward is not a standard at all. It is just another way of saying that the powerful get to be wrong and the powerless get to pay for it, and I had spent 50 years on the paying end of that arrangement. I was not going to rebuild it with my own name on the door. Then I dismissed them, and I went to find out whether a young Marine could be taught instead of broken. A few days later, I had Lance Corporal Maddox brought to my office. He came in expecting a firing squad. I could see it in the way he held himself, rigid, hollow-eyed, a young man who had spent every hour since the gate imagining the end of everything he had worked for. He stood at attention in front of the desk where the woman whose orders he had torn now sat with 2 stars on her collar, and he waited for the axe. I did not give him an axe. I gave him a chair and a long conversation and the weight of the gate he kept. I told him about the fire in 1999, not to impress him, but so he would understand that the people he waved through that gate every day were carrying lives he could not see. I told him I was not going to end his career, and I watched a young man who had walked in expecting destruction slowly understand that he had been handed, instead, the beginning of an education. The thing about a second chance is that it only means something if the person receiving it does the work, and to his credit, Maddox did the work. I heard about it from Stahl over the following weeks. The young Marine had been gutted by what he did, not because he got caught, but because somewhere in that office he had finally understood what he had nearly thrown away. both for himself and for the institution he served. He started showing up early. He started asking Staff Sergeant Beckett the hard questions, the ones that have no comfortable answers. "How do you know?" he asked Beckett one morning. "When you're looking at somebody and you've already made up your mind about them." And Beckett, who was old enough and wise enough to recognize the sound of a man actually changing, told him the truth. "You tore up an admiral's orders, Maddox, because you decided who she was from across a lane. Now you're going to spend the rest of your career learning to see the whole person before you decide anything. That's the job. That's the whole job." While the young Marine was learning to see, my family was being forced to, because the story got out. Not in a cruel way, but a base that size cannot keep a thing like that quiet. And a local reporter wrote a short, warm piece about the new regional commander who had her orders torn up at her own gate and chose to teach the young Marine instead of ending him. The piece ran with a photograph of me in dress uniform, 2 stars catching the light. And there's no way on this earth to call a 2-star admiral paperwork once her picture's in the paper above a headline about her command. My father heard about it before he saw it, and he did not hear it from me. Harold Marsh spent his retirement days down at the marina, the way some old sailors do, sitting near the water that ran their lives. A retired chief he knew was reading the local paper and told him about it, not knowing the connection, just passing the time. "Says here the new admiral running the whole region got her orders torn up at the gate by some kid who didn't know who she was," the man said. "Forgave him, too. Vivian Marsh, her name is." And my father, 80 years old, sat very still by the water and said, almost to himself, That's my Vivian." My brother saw the article on his phone. Glenn, who had introduced me as a woman with a desk for 30 years, who had been saluting mailboxes in my honor since I was 7 years old, looked at the photograph of his sister with 2 stars on her shoulders and a headline that used the word command 4 times. And for the first time in his life, my brother had no joke ready. The nickname he had carried since childhood, Admiral Vivian, the punchline of our family, had just turned out to be true, and not as a joke, and there was nothing left to say. My brother had a nickname for me since I was 7. For the first time, it died in his mouth. I think about my brother in that moment more than I expected I would. For 30 years, the nickname had been his, a small cruelty he almost certainly believed was harmless, a way of keeping his younger sister inside a box he understood and could manage. And the strangest mercy of this whole story is that he had been right by accident the entire time and had spent 3 decades treating the truth as a punchline. There is no apology adequate to that. There is no sentence a person can construct that repairs 30 years of being made small at your own family's dinner table. And to whatever credit I can give him, Glenn did not reach for a cheap one. He did not call me up with a rehearsed speech. He just went quiet and stayed quiet, and the quiet was its own kind of confession. I have come to believe that sometimes the most honest thing a person can do is run out of words and simply stand in the silence where their certainty used to be. We put too much faith in apologies, in the neat verbal package that lets everyone move on. But an apology can be a performance, a way of buying back comfort cheaply. Silence, real silence, the silence of a person watching their whole understanding of you collapse and rebuild itself. That is harder to fake. My brother gave me that silence, and over the following weeks I watched him begin, clumsily, to talk to me like a person he was meeting for the first time, which in a way he was. The sister he had invented at the dinner table all those years ago had finally been retired, and the actual one was standing in front of him, and he did not yet know what to say to her. Neither did I, fully. But we were both, at last, in the same room. And in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, my mother did the thing she had been waiting decades to do. She climbed onto a step stool, took down the 2 shoeboxes from behind the winter blankets where they had lived for 30 years, and she carried them to the kitchen table. She set them down in front of my father without a word. Then she lifted the lids. Inside were 30 years of clippings, the promotion notices, the base paper articles, the small grainy photographs, the entire life of the daughter he had filed under paperwork, the proof he had refused to read, stacked and dated and kept by the one person who never stopped believing. My father sat at that table and looked at the boxes. He took out the clippings one at a time. The commissioning, the destroyer command, the medal from the fire, the promotions, each one a year of a life he had been too certain to see. He was a man who had spent 40 years on decks, who had measured the whole world in wet steel and strong backs, looking at the daughter he had been too sure about, the proof of her stacked in front of him by his wife. And for the first time in his long life, Harold Marsh did not have a single thing to say. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story people want to rush, and it cannot be rushed. My father did not call me the next day with a beautiful apology. That is not who he was, and a tidy apology would have been a lie. What happened was slower and truer than that. It started with a phone call, the first he had made to me in years, and it was not an apology at all. It was an old man fumbling toward one. "Vivian," he said when I picked up. There was a long silence, the silence of a man who had not built the muscles for this kind of talk. "Your mother says there's a change of command thing, a ceremony." Another silence. "I figured maybe a sailor ought to be there, if there's room." If there's room. As if the daughter could not find a seat for the father at her own command. I stood in my office with the phone against my ear, and I felt 50 years of wanting press up against the back of my throat. And I had a choice to make. The same choice I had made about the Marine. I could make him beg. I had earned the right to make him beg. I had waited my whole life for the chance to hold the door closed, the way it had been held closed on me. But I had told a whole command just days before that you give people the dignity of becoming who they could be. I was not going to say that on a podium and then refuse it to my own father. I called Lorna that night and told her, and she said the thing I needed. You don't command a region by collecting debts, Viv. You lead by deciding what to carry and what to set down. You've been carrying your father for 50 years. You get to decide, right now, whether you keep carrying him as a grudge or set him down as a man who's finally trying. So I decided to let my father walk part of the way to me. Not all of it. He had to cross the distance he had built. But I would meet him partway, because that is what you do when someone finally starts moving, even if they start 50 years late. We met for coffee at a diner near the base, 2 days before the ceremony. He looked smaller than I remembered, the way fathers do eventually, the sea finally out of his shoulders. We talked about nothing for a while, the weather, the marina, my mother's garden. And then, haltingly, he asked me about the fire, the one in 1999. He had never asked me about it, not once in 27 years. Your mother kept the article, he said, about the medal. It said you carried a man out. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I never asked you about it. What was it like? So I told him. I told him about the smoke and the heat and the sailor who went down and the last trip back into the compartment and carrying a man out across my shoulders into the dark. My father listened to the whole thing. He did not interrupt. He did not pivot to Glenn. He just listened, an old boatswain's mate hearing. For the first time, what his daughter had done on a black ocean while he was busy being certain she could not do it. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You carried him out. Through that." And I said, "Through that." And he nodded slowly and looked down at his hands, the calloused hands he had measured the whole world by, and I watched something shift in him that had been fixed in place since before I was born. We sat in that diner booth, a father and a daughter spending down 30 years of silence, one honest question at a time. And it was not forgiveness yet, not exactly, but it was the ground that forgiveness grows in. I drove back to the base after that coffee, and I sat in the parking lot for a while, not ready yet to put the Admiral back on, still just a daughter who had finally been asked a question about the worst and best night of her life. I want to be clear that nothing was fixed in that diner booth. 50 years do not dissolve over a cup of coffee and a single honest conversation. There would be other days when my father reached for the old certainty out of habit, when Glenn slipped and said something small, when the gravity of who we had been to each other pulled us back toward the old shapes. Repair is not a moment. It is a practice, a thing you choose again and again, long after the dramatic scene is over and the credits would have rolled. But something had started to move that had been frozen my entire life. And I had learned by then that movement is the whole miracle. People do not change in a single cinematic instant, whatever the films would have you believe. They change the way a ship turns, slowly, with the full weight of where they have been resisting them. the rudder hard over and the bow stubborn against it for what feels like forever. And you have to learn to be patient with the turning, or you will give up 1 degree before the bow finally comes around and call it proof that people never change. My whole career was built on knowing the difference between a ship that will not turn and a ship that is simply still turning. I decided to extend my father the same seamanship. I decided to wait for the bow to come around. Meanwhile, at the gate, a young Marine had become the sentry he should have been all along. Maddox now treated every single person who came through his lane, the ones in rentals and the ones in staff cars, the young and the old, the loud and the quiet, with the same patient care. I heard he said something to a nervous young sailor reporting in one morning, a sailor who had fumbled his paperwork and gone red with embarrassment. "Take your time," Maddox told him. "Everybody who comes through this gate matters until proven otherwise. That's the job." The lesson had taken. I had not destroyed a young man to heal an old wound. I had taught him, and he had grown, and that was worth more than any example I could have made of him. The morning of the change of command came up clear and bright over the water. I stood in my quarters in my dress blues, 2 stars on each shoulder, and I watched out the window as my family arrived on the base. And the road they took, the only road in, ran them straight through the gate where it had all happened. Lance Corporal Maddox was on duty that morning. I learned later exactly how it went, because Beckett told Stahl and Stahl told me, and it is one of my favorite things in this whole story. My family pulled up to the gate, and Maddox checked the guest list, and he saw the name Marsh, and he understood, fully and completely, whose family he was waving through. The father, the mother, the brother of the admiral, whose orders he had torn up on that very pavement 2 weeks before. And he did not flinch, and he did not falter. He came to a crisp courtesy, checked their identification with care, and said, "Welcome aboard, sir, ma'am. The admiral's family has reserved parking. Right this way." My father, who knew nothing of the backstory, who had no idea this was the young man at the center of the article, was quietly impressed by the Marine's bearing. "Good kid," he said to my mother as they drove through. "Squared away." He did not know he was complimenting the boy who tore up his daughter's orders, the boy who had become, in 2 weeks, exactly the sailor my father admired. In the car, my brother tried to say something. Glenn had been quiet for days, ever since the article, and now, driving onto the base where his sister commanded everything in sight, the quiet finally broke. He spoke to our mother, not quite able to say it to me, but I heard about it after. "I spent my whole life calling her Admiral like it was funny," he said, "saluting mailboxes, the whole bit." He looked out the window at the sailors and the ships and the scale of it. "Turns out I got there first by accident. I was right the whole time and I thought I was joking." He could not finish the apology, but he had started it, which was 30 years more than he had ever managed before. And my father, walking from the parking lot toward the ceremony, began to understand the size of what his daughter held. He watched young sailors come to attention as my name was spoken. He watched a chief direct a working party with the same crisp authority he had once carried. Except they were all, every one of them, under the command of the girl who read too much. My father had spent 40 years on decks like these. He had just never once imagined his daughter standing above them. I watched him from inside, through the window, as the scale of it landed on him physically, the way the sea lands on you the first time, and I saw him reach out and steady himself on my mother's arm. I had imagined this morning for weeks, but I had imagined only the Navy part of it, the ceremony, the watch, the formal transfer of a command. I had not let myself imagine my father, in an old funeral suit, walking slowly across a parking lot, and being struck silent by the sheer size of his daughter's life. That was the part I had stopped allowing myself to hope for. Somewhere back in my 30s, because hope of that particular kind had cost me too much, too many times to keep paying for. You can only stand at so many commissionings scanning the crowd for a face that is not there before you teach yourself to stop scanning. I had taught myself well. I had built a whole career on not needing him to show up. And here he was anyway, unasked for, arriving 50 years late on a bright morning by the water, steadying himself on my mother's arm as the scale of it landed on him. I have learned over a long life not to fully trust the feeling that comes right before a thing you have wanted too long finally happens, because that feeling has betrayed me before, has promised arrivals that never came. But I let myself feel it that morning. I stood at the window in my dress blues, and I watched an 80-year-old man understand his daughter for the first time. And I let the feeling come all the way up without bracing against it. I had earned at least that much. After 50 years and 32 of them in uniform, I had earned the right to stand still and let myself be glad. Then it was time. I took my place. I stood in my dress uniform with 2 stars and looked out at the assembled command, the rows of white covers, the flags, the side boys, the whole formal machinery of the Navy assembled to mark the passing of a watch. And in the second row, in a suit that did not quite fit because he had bought it for a funeral years ago and not worn it since, sat my father. He was looking at me, not past me, not at his coffee or his truck or the horizon, at me. I had spent 50 years wanting one old man to look at me like I was possible, and there he was, in the second row, finally looking. The Navy was about to recognize me in front of everyone. The only question left was whether the recognition I had wanted my whole life from one stubborn, sea-worn man would finally arrive, and I could see in his face that it already had. Vice Admiral Brandt stood at the podium and read my record aloud, the way it is done at these ceremonies. And I watched my family hear, for the first time and all at once, the life they had spent decades narrating as paperwork. He read the commands, he read the years at sea, and then he read the citation from 1999. For extraordinary heroism while serving as engineering officer, he read, Lieutenant Marsh repeatedly entered a burning compartment at great personal risk, and through her actions saved both her ship and the life of a fellow sailor, the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. I watched my mother put her hand over her mouth. I watched my father go very still. And then Brandt said the words that closed the distance. Ladies and gentlemen, your new commander, Rear Admiral Vivian Marsh. I stepped forward and I read the watch. I formally relieved the outgoing commander, and I spoke the words that transfer the burden of a command from one set of shoulders to another. And in that moment, Naval Station Norfolk, the largest naval base in the world, every gate and pier and ship of it, became mine to answer for. Off to the side, with the security detail, stood Lance Corporal Maddox, the young man who had torn my orders up on the pavement, watching the woman whose orders he had destroyed assume command of everything he guarded. Our eyes met for just a second. I gave him the smallest nod. He had earned it. The whole arc of it, the gate and the lesson and the work he had done, completed itself silently in that one exchange look, and then I turned back to my command. Afterward, in the crowd of well-wishers, my father came to me. He moved through the people slowly, my mother on his arm, and he stopped in front of me, and he looked at the stars on my shoulders, and then at my face. He still could not find the big words. He was never going to be a man who found the big words, but he found the true one. I was wrong about the wet deck, Vivian, he said. His voice was not steady. The real Navy was you the whole time. I'm sorry it took me this long to look. And then my father, who had never saluted anything in his life because he was enlisted, and the salute went the other way, lifted his old calloused hand to his brow in a stiff, untrained civilian's version of the gesture, rendering to his daughter the honor he had spent 50 years refusing to imagine she could earn. Beside him, my mother stood in the full light of the day, no shoebox to hide anymore, finally allowed to be proud out loud. And she was. She was so proud she was shining with it. My mother told me later that she had kept those shoeboxes precisely for a day she was not certain would ever come, a day when the rest of them would finally need the proof she had been gathering in the dark for 30 years. She had never once doubted that it would all turn out to be true. She had only doubted whether she would live long enough to see them admit it. Standing there in the bright open day, watching her husband lift his rough old hand in a salute to their daughter, she got her answer at last. And I will carry the image of her face that morning for the rest of my life. She had been the one light in the kitchen window the morning I left for college. She had been the one light burning the whole long way through. Every year I stopped calling, every promotion no one celebrated, every silence I mistook for peace. And now, finally, she got to stand in the open sun and let the rest of the world catch up to what she had known since I was a girl with a notebook full of ships. I returned my father's salute because you always return a salute, even an imperfect one, especially an imperfect one. And I want to tell you what I learned standing on that pavement because I think you might need it. Somebody will look at you one day and see the smallest possible version of who you are. A stranger at a gate, a brother at a dinner table, a father in a kitchen. They will decide who you are before you have said a single word, and they will be certain, and they will be wrong. And it will hurt, because the people who underestimate us are so often the people whose belief we wanted most. But here's the thing I needed 50 years to learn, and I am giving it to you for free. You do not owe the world your fury, and you do not owe it your proof. You do not have to tear yourself apart proving you are real to people committed to not seeing you. The truth is, patient. It does the work on its own schedule, and it always, always arrives. And when it does, when the staff car finally pulls up and the orders are pressed back into your hand, you will find that you are already standing exactly where you belong, and that you have been the whole time. That evening, after the crowds had gone, my father and I walked out to a pier, and we stood together looking at the water, doing what it has always done. Two sailors of two different navies, 50 years of distance finally close enough, at last, to reach across. If you've ever had someone look at you and see nothing but the smallest possible version of who you are, a stranger at a gate or someone at your own family's table, then you already know why I needed to tell you this story. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Did the recognition you waited for ever come, and did it come from the person you wanted it from most? Would you have ended that young Marine's career or tried to teach him the way I did? And if someone in your own family spent years underestimating you, did they ever finally see you for who you really are? Tell me. I read every comment. And if this story meant something to you, take a second to subscribe before you go.